What would you learn about the authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, if you were in the front row seat, if you were sitting in the very chair just across from them as they are sitting there writing? Who wrote it, when, why, all this, the five Y's and the W, the H, I mean. Well, we kind of have that view. We have that in Papias. He is our earliest historian who tells us where the Gospels came from and who wrote them. But before we get into that, just you've probably watched a lot of videos already. There's a lot out there on the YouTubes. What from like Barterman, of course, he's a very popular scholar. Michael Bird, Chris Cornwith, Wes Huss, or even Faith Because of Reason. Videos that I have watched that is talking about Papias. But this is the trouble I've found with them. They seem to be apologists on both sides. One is outright front. They're apologists, and they're arguing for their side of why the Gospels is what they are and from this information. And the other side is the scholarly, more hesitant to undercut everything that we've known for the last 1800 years. I say 1800 years because in the last 200 years, since I think Albert Schweitzer puts in the late 1700s, academia has largely pushed aside the early historian, the church fathers as sometimes they're referred to, and looked more of eternal evidence of who was the authorship of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But I would like to push that all aside, blow away the chaff, I may say, to get the wheat, the real what they say, where we can get a better understanding of where the Gospels came from. So I got to be honest with you. These are my opinions, and we can't really get away from my bias. They're going to creep in, and that's where I'm hoping you can come in here. Through the comments, you can tell me, hey, whoa, there's a blind spot of yours. You're saying something you shouldn't be saying there. That's speaking more than what they're saying, or you've missed something. So I definitely need you in the comments to help me there, to comment on it. And if you like the video, just the way we're processing this, please give it a like. But more importantly, I need your feedback of if we're getting this correctly. So back to what I said. So Papias is our earliest witness to the authorship of the Gospels. So what do we know about Papias? So roughly he lives between 60 and 130 AD. So not quite the same time as Jesus, but very close. He's a peer of Josephus around that time. So he knows roughly. And he writes what is called the Exposition of the Oracles, oracles being the sayings of the Lord. And it's a 5-book collection. Unfortunately, and this is a big downer, we only have 10 small fragments, little collections of sayings. And these sayings are largely only from Irenaeus, who wrote Against Heresies, Eusebius in church history, and a little bit from, hopefully I'm saying this right, Anastasia Senatia from the 7th century in his commentary on Genesis. He gives, I think it's fragment number 9. So we don't have much, but because it's so early, it's so valuable. So let's continue on there. Another thing to know about Papias is he's from Hierapolis, which is in modern day Turkey, not near the edges, but more inland. And Papias, his proximity to the authors of Gospels, he claims to be a hearer of John, a friend of Polycarp. So this is fragment 9, like I said, the one that Antithesis records. He says, a disciple of the apostle who leaned on the bosom of Christ. That sounds a lot like John. And I'm going to get back to what I think about that fragment, that statement, but let's just say he's a close hearer, because we have another fragment that also kind of tells us of how his close proximity to the authors, or at least the apostles, are. So let us continue. So where is he getting his information from? Where's Papias? So Papias claims direct apostolic source. So he claims that whenever anyone came from the apostles or the church, he'd always ask them, what did Andrew say? What did Peter say? What did Matthew say? So he would directly ask them, I want to hear the living word testimony, not just what is written down. So that's important. And he personally is connected to Aristion and the Presbyterian John, maybe referred to as the Elder John. Now that could be mixed up with John, the son of Zebedee, or may not be. And the scholars kind of debate that, but that's roughly where we're placing it. So he's got a connection and he's very passionate to hear directly from the apostles, the early eyewitnesses of what Jesus said and what he did. And that's who he's referring to. So like I said, we have 10 fragments, but we do have references. So in Irenaeus Against Heresies, in book 5 specifically, he writes, "Now testimony is borne to these things in writing by Papias, an ancient man who was a hearer of John, a friend of Polycarp, in the fourth of his books, for 5 books was composed of him." So he speaks fairly highly of him. So we have a fairly good eyewitness. So Irenaeus comes a little bit later in history, but he stayed time. He talks very highly of Papias, of his credentials. And like I say, Eusebius is one who records most of his works that we have from. Eusebius has kind of a love-hate relationship with Papias, and I'm going to get a little bit into that. But first of all, I would like to kind of point out, so a few nights ago, I was watching Survivor. You know, the tribal council. They're all sitting around, they're figuring out and talking about who they're going to vote out, etc. And Jeff is interviewing them. It's kind of a fun little part of Survivor. But the thing that really got me there was thinking about is like throughout the tribal council, they're always panning the camera over to this one lady as her face remarks how she responded to everybody. And it's just, the fact is that the only reason they knew it was important to show those pictures is they knew the end of the vote. And in some ways, Eusebius is the same thing. He's looking back at how the church came up to accept the 4 Gospels. And then he's picking who he thinks helped to form that opinion. And he picked Papias as his first reference to who, of which Gospels they picked and why. So just kind of keep that in mind. And like I say, a love-hate relationship, because Papias talks trash, or no, sorry, Eusebius talks trash about Papias. He really has his opinion that, pretty much calls him a man of low intelligence and doesn't really respect him. But at the same time, even though he doesn't seem to really respect him, he quotes him. So there's got to be a little bit of respect there. I think it's more he doesn't like his opinion of the end times, which many of us disagree of how the world is going to come to an end when Jesus returns, etc. So I understand how Eusebius is kind of pushing back about how he sees this Papias interpreting that. And maybe it's much more about that than whether his information is correct about the source of the gospel. So like I said, I want to answer the 5 W's and the H. Who, what, where, when, why, and how we got the Gospels according to these writers. So to do that, I'm going to read Eusebius' biggest quote that he has in regards to Papias and the origin of the Gospels. And it starts like this. "A tradition regarding Mark, who wrote the Gospel, which he," so that's Papias, "has given the following words. And the Presbyterians said this, Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered. It was not, however, in exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessities of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's saying. Wherefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For one thing, he took special care not to omit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements." This is what is related by Papias regarding Mark. So this is Eusebius doing his commentary. "But with regards to Matthew, he has made the following statements." So Papias now recording about Matthew. "Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord. So again, Eusebius is telling which oracles these are, in the Hebrew language. And each one interpreted them the best he could." So that's in fragment 6. Or you could read in Eusebius' Church, Book 3, Chapter 39, Section 15 to 17. I think the easiest one to break down here is his short statement in regards to Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. So what do we know? Who wrote it? He's saying it was the Apostle Matthew, who we also know from Luke and Mark as Levi. Same kind of calling story there. and it's sayings, or as in the Greek, I'm not a Greek speaker, but this is how it says in Greek, logia, of Jesus. So the sayings of Jesus. Keep that in mind because that's going to get us to figure out the when. So he doesn't tell us when, but he tells us the apostle Matthew wrote it. And we also know from hindsight here, roughly that Matthew martyrdom was around 68 AD. So if he's got this information right, Matthew would have to have written before 68 AD because dead men don't write. Okay? So it's fairly early, fairly close to the time of Jesus. We don't know his why, the how. So again, Matthew compiled the logi in the Hebrew language. That's something to keep in mind. It's in the Hebrew language. I'll get a little bit more into the debate about exactly what that is, but it's very important that we understand it's in the Hebrew language, and the Gospel of Matthew that we read in our English Bibles is Greek. So Matthew wrote in the Hebrew language. Keep that in mind. Papias never quotes from the Gospel of Matthew that we know of. So again, he has his 5 books, oracles or sayings of Jesus, but we have lost those. So, but as much as we know, he never quotes from the Gospel of Matthew. And he doesn't tell us anything about the order of which gospel is written first. He just said, Mark wrote this, Matthew wrote this one. But let's get into the Mark one here. So who? So again, he says Mark. So we often attach that to John Mark, cousin of Barnabas, fellow worker of the Apostle Paul. There's a whole big backstory about that in Acts. But this Mark was an interpreter of Peter. Interpreter, translator, most likely to help Peter overcome his lack of Greek. Because again, Peter, uneducated fisherman, speaks Aramaic, a little bit of Hebrew possibly, not so likely Greek. So Mark is acting as his translator. What did he write down? He wrote down accurately the things said, done by Christ based on Peter's teaching. So remember here, Mark is working as Peter's translator, but according to Papias, after he's translated and helped present all these sermons from him, he writes them down. When did he write them down? So we know roughly that the Apostle Peter was martyred between 64 and 67 AD. Okay, so a little bit before Matthew. The 64 to 67 is because scholars lean towards 67. Scholars lean towards 64 when Nero's persecution first broke out after the fire of Rome, where church history leans towards 67, and that is for Peter can be the Pope in Rome for 25 years. I haven't unpacked that yet. I don't really know how to talk about that, but so roughly but that really doesn't matter because Mark could live another 100 years, unlikely, but he could, and write down his information if he recalled it correctly. We know roughly, again, 68, the same as Matthew, that Mark is martyred in Alexandria, so down in Egypt, not Rome, down in Egypt, around 68. So we know the gospel is probably written before that, if it's the same Mark being written. And the why? The why, of course, is to preserve the teachings of Peter, the narratives of what Peter recalls about what Jesus did, and some of what he spoke, but much more of what he did, which the Gospel of Mark that we know does kind